So I did a poll the other day asking you guys what frame would you like to see as the next frame guide, and to my surprise, Sevagoth won. So here we are doing a Sevagoth guide. Now I will admit, prior to this poll I actually haven't paid much attention to him. I've just known him to be Gloom Boy and that's that. But in this video we dive into Sevagoth, learning everything about him as well as how to keep him alive, as that is one of his main issues. Now, Sevagoth is quite complex, so a large portion of this video will be going over his abilities and synergies, so bear with me on this one. But I will say I am pleasantly surprised by him and I actually quite enjoy his playstyle. Before we dive in, be sure to follow me on Twitch to catch me when I go live. Alright, let's hop straight into it. Firstly, before we go into his passive and his abilities, there is something I need to explain first. You see, Sevagoth is quite complex because he isn't just a Warframe. Sevagoth has a Warframe form and a Shadow form, each with their own abilities, and each of them can be modded as if they were a frame. Each of them have unique interactions and kind of intertwine with each other. The Shadow form has an Exalted Claw that comes with the Shadow form. His Warframe abilities are called Reap, Sow, Gloom, and Exalted Shadow, and his Shadow's abilities are called Embrace, Consume, Death's Harvest, and Reunite. I've listed these names so it's easier for you guys to understand and have a bit more context when I start explaining his passive and his abilities. Now let's talk about Sevagoth's passive. Sevagoth has quite a unique passive. When you die with Sevagoth, you will transform into the Shadow version of him. You will be able to control the Shadow and collect 5 souls by casting one of his abilities called Consume, which will then revive you. You will effectively lunge forward and grab souls. When you die, you will see the soul counter appear above Sevagoth's abilities, as well as the bleed out countdown to see how much longer until you die. One thing to take note here is the Shadow form will still take damage in this form and can die. If the Shadow dies before you're able to gain 5 souls, you will then go back to the bleed out duration of your frame. Now, when it comes to his abilities, I'm going to go over his main frame's abilities and then I will go over the Shadow's abilities separately, so it's easier to understand and digest. The first ability is called Reap. Sevagoth's first ability sends out your Shadow, ravaging enemies in its path. If you hold this ability down, the Shadow will move faster than if you just tapped it. You can also change the trajectory of the Shadow by aiming with your weapon. The Shadow will weaken all of the enemies who come into contact with it. The Shadow will mark them with Death's Harvest, which is the Shadow's third ability. Enemies marked with Death's Harvest will receive increased damage vulnerability. I will be going over the augments for Sevagoth in a separate section in this video, so just stay tuned for that. Reap synergizes very well with Sevagoth's second ability called Sow. Now, Sow implants a seed into all enemies in a radius. Enemies affected will take true damage per second, and if you cast Reap, his first ability, onto enemies affected by Sow, they will explode for 25% of their health as true damage and will also detonate, dealing 25% of their current health as blast damage as well. So basically a nuking synergy between Reap and Sow. They work very, very well together. We now move on to Sevagoth's third ability called Gloom. I think most of you know about this ability as it is quite a popular one amongst the Warframe community. Summon an aura around you that will slow enemies down up to 95% with 272% ability strength, which is insane in itself. And it will also siphon their health and heal you and allies within the aura. Gloom is a channel ability and will drain your energy for each enemy affected by Gloom, stacking up to 10 enemies, which will be 7.5 energy per second. Increasing your ability duration will lower this drain. Gloom is quite an energy hungry ability, so besides increasing your ability duration, I would recommend running Equilibrium for energy sustain. Energy Nexus will only work if no enemy is affected by Gloom, which means it won't be draining any energy. This is not ideal as, let's face it, when are you not going to have an enemy nearby when playing Warframe? We now move on to his fourth ability called Exalted Shadow. You would have noticed by now an icon above your abilities. This is called Deathwell. As you kill your enemies and use your abilities against them, it will begin to fill up Deathwell. When Deathwell is above 75%, you can then cast Exalted Shadow, which turns you into the Shadow form of Sevagoth. Gloom will slowly add to the Deathwell when it affects enemies. Reap and Sow will also increase the Deathwell's gauge by a lot when you kill enemies affected by them. When you go into the Shadow form, it will drain Deathwell by 1% per second. The Shadow form is a melee focused playstyle with different types of abilities. You will then make use of his exalted weapon called Shadow Claws, which we will go over the build later on in the video. You will only be able to use your claws when in the Shadow form and you cannot use any other weapons. Ability Strength will increase the damage of your Shadow Claws as well. Like I mentioned earlier, the Shadow form can also be modded just like a Warframe. Now this does effectively mean you will have to form a Sevagoth, Sevagoth Shadow, and Sevagoth Claws. So yes, there is a rather big downside to Sevagoth. It is the massive form investment for this frame. Before we go into Shadow's abilities, I do want to note that Sevagoth's abilities will stay active when you switch to the Shadow form. For example, you can cast Gloom, then switch to the Shadow, which will then allow you to have Gloom active, but only on Sevagoth and not the Shadow. And Archon shards will only affect Sevagoth, not the Shadow. Alright, let's move on to Shadow's abilities. The first one is Embrace. Shadow will pull enemies in an 80-degree angle. Enemies are pulled and ragdolled towards you. This is really good for the melee, as you can easily group enemies up and hit multiple enemies at once with the claws. This is very similar to Mag's pull. Consume, dash through enemies and rip their souls out to heal Shadow. Consume will deal radiation damage and knock enemies down, while also healing Shadow's health for 25% of the damage dealt. Casting speed will also increase the dash speed of this ability. Gloom synergizes with this ability and will also help healing Shadow's health with the lifesteal Gloom gives. This is of course if you are in the radius of Gloom while you are in Shadow's form. We then move on to Death's Harvest. Shadow will cast out a curse, leaving a mark on all the enemies in a radius. Marked enemies will receive damage vulnerability, which is of course affected by ability strength. Each enemy marked and killed will fill up Deathwell's gauge for Exalted Shadow, but this will only work if you are controlling Sevagoth. This means that if you are in the Shadow form, you can cast Death's Harvest, hop back into Sevagoth, kill all the enemies, get back up to 100% for Deathwell's gauge, and then hop back into the Shadow form. A bit confusing, but it's a nice little strategy if you want to keep switching between very quickly. We then have Reunite, which is the same as Exalted Shadow, it just puts you back into Sevagoth's form. That's pretty much concludes this ability. Now that was a lot of info, I am fully aware, but let's go over the augments for Sevagoth so that we can conclude him and also explain how to play him and the synergies that work with him. Now for the augments for Sevagoth, he has two, Shadow Haze and Dark Propagation. Shadow Haze is an augment for Reap, his first ability. This augment will increase critical chance by 50% to enemies affected by either Reap or Death's Harvest. When those enemies die, a new shadow will spawn from their corpse seeking other enemies. This is limited to 3 shadows. This crit bonus is affected by ability strength. We then have Dark Propagation. Now Dark Propagation is an augment for Sow. Enemies killed while inflicted with Sow spread its effect in a 15-meter radius. Shadow's Death Harvest will also inflict Sow. This is a new augment for Sevagoth, and let's just say this mod drastically improves Sevagoth's nuking potential when paired with Shadow Haze, because the explosions that you get from Sow are now increased with Shadow Haze and further spread with Dark Propagation. This pretty much creates a chain reaction that kills multiple enemies. And that also concludes Sevagoth's abilities and his augments. Just very quickly, how to farm Sevagoth. Well, his main blueprint can be acquired from completing the Call of Tempestari questline. All of his components have a 10% chance of being awarded as a bonus reward at the end of Voidstorm missions in Railjack, but exclusively in Neptune Proxima, Pluto Proxima, and Veil Proxima fishes. So if you don't like Railjack, well, rip. Okay, I have dumped a crap ton of info on you regarding his abilities and augments. So how do we actually play him and build him? Before we go further, if you could smash that like button, it would really help me out with the video. It goes a super long way for me and it only takes a second. Thank you so much. I'm going to divide this part of the video into 2 sections. The first for those of you who want to play Sevagoth making use of Shadow and having no helminth on him. The second is for those of you who want to play Sevagoth with no Shadow and subsuming his 4th ability. This is my favorable playstyle for him for 2 reasons. The first being it is a nuke focused playstyle with super satisfying explosions. The second is because you don't have to invest so much former into him as you will subsume Shadow off, meaning you don't need to form a Shadow or his claws. Alright, let's actually talk about how to play and build base Sevagoth with no helminth. Sevagoth is quite squishy in general. This is one of his biggest downsides, so I have 2 different types of builds to keep him alive more, which we will go over in just a bit. You are going to want to keep Gloom up. Gloom is Sevagoth's survivability and slows enemies down drastically while giving you lifesteal as well. Your second and first ability are used to nuke enemies in the room if you are using the double augment setup. Sevagoth mainly uses the kill enemies before they can kill you tactic to survive. Now there are 2 ways I went about building Sevagoth. a shield gating setup for those of you who like shield gating, and then I did a health tanking setup, which I usually don't do, but I actually found to be slightly better when playing solo with Sevagoth. Sevagoth is quite energy hungry because Gloom saps up your energy like no other. So I went for more efficiency as well as equilibrium for more energy sustain. But Sevagoth is also quite needy in some stats. And the problem is we run a double augment setup with him, which means we immediately lose 2 mod slots. So instead of using Flow for more energy, I opted for blue Archon shards with energy to substitute the needed energy for him. If you don't have Archon shards, you can drop Streamline and run Flow. This is what the end game build looks like here. Again, for those of you who don't have the fancy mods, you can make a budget and use whatever arcanes you have available. Although I would recommend running Molt Augmented for strength, as Sevagoth scales really well with strength. We then move on to the health tanking setup. The health tanking setup consists of health conversion, adaptation, arcane blessing, and arcane reaper. If you don't have the arcanes, you can scale more strength, but scaling health is quite important here for the setup to work. This is what the build would look like. As you are going about your gameplay loop, when you have filled up Deathwell, you can then hop into your Shadow form to make use of Shadow and its claws. Now, here comes the issue with Sevagoth. His Shadow has a severe skill issue in surviving. You're going to have to invest into Shadow and his claws for him to shine a bit. I have tried shield gating with Shadow and I found it doesn't work that well, as the nature of his abilities aren't the greatest for shield gating. And you just get one tapped in high level content, so it gets a little bit frustrating. However, this testing was done while playing solo Steel Path, which is an entirely different ballgame than playing in a group or a public lobby, or if you were playing in Star Chart. So we resort to health tanking. You can go for the generic adaptation, health and armor scaling that works really well. Or, suggested to me by Sci-Fi Freak on stream, you can go Rolling Guard, allowing you to have invulnerability and status cleanse, go for Hunter Adrenaline so you can have really good energy sustain, and then run Quick Thinking, which stops you from getting killed. I also ran Vitality on Shadow to increase the base health as well, and then I ran Arcane Reaper as well as Arcane Blessing. This is what the endgame build looks like for Shadow. For those of you who don't have the fancy Prime mods, you can just use the base ones for a budget build, and you can also replace Umbral Intensify with Normal Intensify if you don't want to use such a hefty mod for capacity. Also, if you want to invest more Former, it's a good idea to put Preparation in the Extra slot so you can start in Shadow's form with full energy. When it comes to actually playing Shadow, well, it's actually a simple gameplay loop. Keep casting your 1 to pull enemies in and use your claws to kill multiple enemies. Cast Death's Harvest so enemies have damage vulnerability, and then we have Consume, but here's the thing, Consume is a weird one for me. I find this ability to be very wonky in my opinion, and I don't really enjoy it, so honestly you can use this ability at your own discretion. If you die while in Shadow's form or you run out of Deathwell, you can just repeat the normal gameplay loop when in Sevagoth's form to get back into your Shadow form. This does lead me onto Shadow's Claws, the Exalted weapon. Now I will say you are unfortunately going to have to invest heavily into the Claws. Even for a budget build you would need about 4 or 5 Former if you are wanting to use Tenekai, which I would highly recommend. Now the Claws are a bit interesting. In the forward moving attack you won't proc any slash procs. But if you attack while not moving, you will proc slash procs on your enemies. On that same note, heavy attacks from the claws will force proc slash, dealing huge amounts of bleed ticks, so Tenekai is quite important for these claws in my opinion, as you can proc Tenekai quite often. We do have a main build here that fully focuses on slash damage. If you want to use other Tenekai mods, you will have to add another form, or you can make a budget version of this build by not running primed mods if you would like. Then we have another build setup which Sci-Fi Freak also showed me on stream, which is a blast version on the claws. This build actually works incredibly well, as blast will explode when an enemy dies, and when you heavy attack with these claws you can easily pop groups of enemies with Embrace. This is what the build looks like here, and the nice thing is it is a bit more budget as well, which works very well even though it's budget. Now this pretty much concludes Sevagoth as a base frame and how he is meant to be played without a helmet. As you can see, there are 2 downsides to him: the massive Former investment needed for this frame and the survivability, which can be fixed when building him correctly. Now if you're someone who just wants to focus on Sevagoth's main nuking playstyle, which is incredibly satisfying and has completely taken me by surprise, you're going to save a lot more Former because you won't need to form a Shadow or his claws, which leaves you with just Sevagoth. Now before we go into the builds, I need to explain how the nuking works and how to get a chain reaction on your screen. Well, Like I explained earlier, Dark Propagation spreads Death's Harvest to enemies when they die while being inflicted by So. Shadow Haze will increase the amount of shadows sent out by Reap, which will proc the explosions from Dark Propagation. When the enemies are affected by So and you use Reap, they will explode for 25% of their health as true damage and 25% as blast damage. But if you subsume Raw on your 4th ability and activate it, it will increase the damage of these explosions. Even if you don't subsume Raw over your 4th, and if you prime enemies with Viral, the explosions will deal more damage, ultimately one-shotting them with the chain reaction. So, in order for you to one-shot with the nuking playstyle, you will need to either have Raw or prime them. It's your choice, or you can use both. A good option is the Epitaph, allowing you to prime enemies in an AoE as you move through the missions. I even have a Raw build which you can pair priming and Raw together to do even more damage. This nuking playstyle is so strong that it can even one-tap Thraxes at pretty much any level. Although there are times that you may need to cast it 1 or 2 times, but this is still OP if you think about it. And this is because the explosions are dealt as a percentage of their health, which is what makes it so overpowered. Meaning, the more health they have, the more damage you simply do. Hence why it is such a fun way to play Sevagoth. I do want to say that this nuking playstyle also applies to the no helminth setup as well. It doesn't change that just because you subsume something over your 4th. You can still nuke with him like normal. It just means that you will switch into your shadow form, which you will not be able to make use of the nuking playstyle. Now that pretty much concludes how the nuking works with Sevagoth. We now move on to the helminth builds, which guess what, are pretty much the exact same as the non-helminth builds, but you just subsume something over your 4th. The first one we have is the raw setup, which I mentioned earlier. Subsume over your 4th, and if you want to be cheeky, you can drop Streamline and run Precision Intensify to give yourself a huge strength boost when casting raw, but this is up to you. I personally went for more energy sustain because I like to spam my abilities. I'm a chronic spammer, what can I say? We then have another setup, which is my personal favorite, which is a Silence Gloom build with the nuking playstyle. This is a deadly combo because Silence will stun enemies, locking them into an animation, and Gloom will slow down that animation considerably. So enemies that are affected by this combo cannot do anything for the most part. This will keep you alive a lot more and offer a nice and easy experience with Sevagoth, as you can constantly just nuke enemies while they cannot do anything. You can also run a Nourish setup as well, or you can subsume anything that you want over your 4th ability. Please feel free to change up the builds and their stats to what you like. Sevagoth actually benefits a lot more from having strength, as you can even push red crits with the Augments Shadow Haze. These are just the playstyles that I really enjoy and the builds that I found to be quite nice with Sevagoth. When it comes to Archon shards with Sevagoth, depending on if you are using flow or not, I would suggest running 2 or more blue shards with energy to substitute the needed energy. And then I would recommend casting speed shards and strength shards, as he will need some casting speed for his abilities, and also he will benefit from more strength. You can actually further increase Sevagoth's nuking potential by making use of Nautilus to pull enemies in. This will make it easier for your shadow from Reap to target enemies and spread the explosions. Here is a Nautilus build that I run, and of course we make use of Cordon. If you want to make use of the Grimoire as a stat stick, that will work too. Here you can use the invocations that give you either strength or duration or efficiency, whichever one you want for your build. But if you do use the Grimoire, you will have to make use of the Cedo as a primer with Viral. The Cedo works really well, as the glaive will just bounce around the room priming enemies. To conclude this video, what are my final thoughts on Sevagoth? Well, he absolutely surprised me. I honestly thought he was ass for the longest time, as people were telling me he's not that great. But I will admit, this opinion of mine is carried by the dual augment playstyle, and that is why I was so surprised by him. He is by far one of the most satisfying nuke frames right now, and the chain explosions just never get old, to be honest. I really enjoy him now, and even without the dual augments and maybe just one, I think he is still okay. His shadow playstyle isn't even that bad. He's very active, doesn't have a boring playstyle, and if you are like me who has overlooked Sevagoth, I recommend you check again because you will not regret it. The only big downside is the huge form investment if you want to play with Shadow. Otherwise, that pretty much concludes the video. I will not yap on any longer. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And as always, a massive thank you to all of our channel members. You guys are the best. I will see you all in the next one.